In my first video, I pointed out that ask yourself's argument is invalid, and the most obvious way of remedying this invalidity invites other problems. This means the argument needs some additional premises or a better formulation, and this is a job for the vegan looking to defend the argument. So I'm going to leave it here for now. But as it stands, these objections alone warrant rejecting the vegan argument. That being said, the discussion in the previous video was fairly abstract, so this time I'm going to be a little more concrete with my examples. Let's begin then by looking at how the argument works against an actual property. Often the first property to people's mind is advanced cognitive capacities, or something along those lines. Against this, the vegan can easily retort that some humans have cognitive capacities roughly on a par with animals, and we certainly don't think it's right to slaughter these people. Actually, perhaps this isn't the best example, but usually we wouldn't be okay with killing stupid people in virtue of their stupidity. Babies, the comatose, and people with mental disabilities are perhaps better or at least more sympathetic examples. Now, non-vegans might retort by saying it is being the kind of thing that usually does have a certain standard of cognitive capacities that makes the thing morally valuable. Now, apart from being quite ad hoc, this suggestion that moral status obtains, even if the trait responsible remains only potential, might need some further explanation. Suppose an abnormally intelligent animal were found, a dolphin, or whatever, that had demonstrated cognitive capacities of a standard high enough to warrant moral consideration. The inverse assumption that we should refrain from treating this animal morally on account of its species not usually possessing such capacities seems quite counterintuitive, at least to me and every budget family movie ever. Now, perhaps a quick fix can be found in futures of value, the way Don Marquis has argued against abortion. Marquis says it's wrong to abort not because the fetus is a person, but because killing it would deprive it of its future of value. Now, this explanation generalizes quite nicely to explain the wrongness of killing hermits, whose murder might otherwise have no untoward consequences, as well as the rightness of euthanasia, at least where a person's remaining life is not valuable enough to pursue. So the idea would be that beings which will develop the relevant cognitive faculties ought to be counted as worthy of moral status. This works for the infant, but may not help very much with cases of severe cognitive impairment, since the affected individuals may not have the desired future. So it looks like citing cognition as the non-vegan cutoff point will require some duct tape, even if future value keeps us from rampant infanticide. Alright, let's remind ourselves briefly of our objective here. We're looking for some property P which humans have and animals do not. Moreover, if P applied to animals, they would be worthy of moral consideration, and if it did not apply to humans, they would not. Both conditions must be met by any proposed P, and our vegan argument revolves around tests of these two claims, or one or other for any proposed property. Actually, usually it's just the latter claim which is tested. We see that when P is cognitive capacities, the vegan claims that we still treat humans as though they had moral value, even absent such capacities. Hence, cognitive capacities fails to adequately explain human moral worth. As to the second condition, however, that is, if we suppose there were some animals with these capacities, would they then be worthy of moral consideration? As I've said, I think most people would accept this intuition, meaning cognitive capacities is not wholly devoid of merit. It fails only to explain the worth of humans without said capacities. Now, there are at least two options available to those insisting on cognitive capacities here. One involves biting the bullet and simply denying those humans value, or attributing to them the same value we do to animals, if we want to go that route. Of course, we would have to explain our reluctance to interfere with or harm such individuals, but this could be achieved by appealing to the moral status of beings who care about the lacking individual, so friends, family, carers, etc. Absent second-hand concerns from individuals with moral status, we would have no reason to extend moral consideration to said entities. I'm actually somewhat surprised I haven't seen anyone take this option. It seems quite defensible, unless there's something perfectly obvious I'm missing here. Appealing to the interests of morally valuable beings also allows us to tidily extend the same explanation given above to pets. Now, there is perhaps the unattractive consequence that it would not be wrong to kill or harm someone cognitively impaired who hasn't the care of a morally valuable being. But I don't think that's actually as unintuitive as it seems. This is because it's quite probable that one so impaired and without anyone caring for their interests would not survive very long anyway, and so the actual amount of moral unpleasantness entailed by this position seems far worse than it actually is. especially when the amount of such individuals without anyone caring for them is probably rather limited in light of human sociality. The latter, by the way, can also be appealed to in explaining why the view initially seems so abhorrent or unacceptable. Basically, if one takes this option, the major task is explaining why it does not make you a monster. Opponents of the view will have to find cases which cannot be so cleanly swept away, or pick holes in this story and ones like it. Now, the second option here is to say that while cognitive capacities do seem sufficient for possession of moral worth, they are not necessary for it. So, if a being has these capacities, they deserve moral status, or at least that fact is sufficient to attribute moral status to them. However, it is not necessary insofar as there could be other ways to attain moral status. Moreover, there could be other reasons for attributing or withholding moral status. None would doubt that Hitler had similar cognitive capacities to the rest of our species, yet most of us would, if able, withhold moral consideration from him or any similarly inclined individuals. Similarly, if the hyper-intelligent animal from our previous example took a Hitlerian turn, I should think its moral status would again be called into question. This makes all the more plausible the suggestion that there isn't just one acceptable moral-making property which is both necessary and sufficient for all moral status. Moral status is, in all likelihood, a more complicated affair, and while a cursory glance might leave cognitive capacities, or any other individual property for that matter, in quite bad shape, careful consideration suggests that no single property will be able to fulfill all of our moral expectations or explain all of our intuitions about moral status. Nor do we have any reason to expect such simplicity. In the next section, I discuss agnosticism about animal value. Originally, I was going to exclude this, as it seemed to me to stray too far from the argument itself. Fortunately, I recently heard Ask Yourself mount a defense of his namethetrait against something like the Bigfoot objection I raised previously. The complaint was that there may be such a trait, we simply don't know about it, and Ask Yourself's objection to this is that even if we hadn't yet identified the appropriate trait, were we dealing with humans, we would refrain from action till we were sure. The idea is that we wouldn't treat humans immorally just because we weren't sure they had moral status. And he thinks this leads back into the trait argument, since we can then ask, well, what is the difference between humans and animals, which makes us refrain from killing the one but not the other when agnostic about their respective moral status? So let's consider agnosticism about animal values and its implications for the argument. It seems reasonable enough for most vegans to presume the non-vegans they will be arguing with will hold something like humans possess moral value and animals do not. Again, nihilists exempted. And so you could look at this as the conjunction of VH and not V of A, which just means value of humans and not value of animals. So it seems that the non-vegan must defend this conjunction, but it is possible for one to hold the first conjunct without making a similar claim about animals at all. That is, one might think humans have moral worth while being agnostic about animal value. When the vegan next hurls accusations of inconsistency, his opponent can simply admit belief in human value without claiming to know why or otherwise predicating value of anything else. Vegans might be inclined to cry hypocrisy at this line. If you treat animals as if they had no moral worth, you are not agnostic about them. You deny value to animals. So if we are practicing meat eaters, we can't claim agnosticism. After all, in other cases of agnosticism about moral conduct, perhaps like abortion and euthanasia, we tend to approach the matter cautiously. Not so in the case of animals, whose death has become industry. If this sounds familiar, it's because this sort of claim also underlies Ask Yourself's defense to the Bigfoot objection we mentioned above. If it's right, then most practicing meat eaters cannot avail of the agnostic strategy, and Ask Yourself will be able to employ a similar premise against Bigfoot objections. Or so it appears, but appearance isn't always reality. First, the empirical case for the latter claim is not unobjectionable. Although everyone is liable to agree on the lack of agreement in cases like abortion and euthanasia, many more are equally inclined to act in such cases. Many take the necessary action, leaving the state, country, etc., needed to achieve either, and while some may claim to have a strong belief one way or the other, there are surely many more who make no such claims. They act out of practical concern, without regard for morality. The point is that even though no consensus exists on the matter, people still act wherever they feel compelled to, or in accord with whatever their own beliefs or interests are, justified or not. Basically, many people do act in situations where potential human moral status is ambiguous, or the parties involved claim agnosticism. And these cases are far from infrequent, so the vegan makes a faulty empirical assumption about how people treat agnosticism in human context, which is not supported, and perhaps not supportable. So our first option is just denying the claim's truth outright, since it readily admits of counter-instances. A second option, if this doesn't convince you, consider instead the low crime rate of moral anti-realists. Now, an anti-realist is someone who does not think for a given topic there is a objective fact of the matter what the case is. So you can be anti-realist about many things. It's just a little piece of philosophical jargon that gets thrown about quite frequently. Many philosophers are anti-realist about ethics nowadays, meaning they don't think there is a fact of the matter about ethical propositions. So remarkably few of them actually act like it. They don't take what they will, kill their rivals, or attempt to pass off invalid arguments as valid. But I don't think we would be inclined to say that these philosophers are not really anti-realist. In fact, imagine a hypothetical anti-realist who behaves exactly as a moral realist would. They're behaviourally equivalent, except with respect to their belief in answer to questions about the truth-aptness of moral propositions. If we ask this possible anti-realist who is a realist in every actual moral act, would he assent to the proposition humans are valuable, or VH as we've been shorthanding it? Now clearly the answer is no, and since that just is what it is to believe something, the behaviour isn't all that relevant. Additionally, prepared anti-realists often have a barrage of explanations of these behavioural facts to hand. They might say that the tribe's morality is merely a social or evolutionary phenomena which gravitates around cultures. This would be enough for them to deny substantive moral truth while also explaining the way their own behaviour in accordance with it. The latter arising out of socio-historical or biological factors, which may even have some practical benefit in terms of social cohesion, but which nonetheless carry no actual ethical import. So it seems like many mediators could take the agnostic position, even in spite of objections based on their treatment of animals. Needless to say then, I don't find Askerself's attempt to slip back into the only argument he seems to feel comfortable with very compelling. There are many cases where it is genuinely unclear that a human has moral status, and in those cases people do not always default on extending moral consideration. So the bare empirical premise behind this new demand for a property is unfounded, as well as facing the additional problems namethetrait itself did in the first place. So perhaps it would be better to try and fix the original argument before extending it. Perhaps worse still, agnosticism may even be capable of providing another way of rejecting the vegan argument where wanting. Askerself and veganism aside, I think agnosticism can be worked into an interesting view where we treat the term morally valuable as a vague predicate. Vague predicates are ones which admit of borderline cases. Rich is one such predicate. Although there are clear cases of people who are either rich or not rich, there are also cases where it's not so clear. And picking a definite point at which someone becomes rich seems at best highly arbitrary and at worst impossible. Suppose we say that anyone who earns over X per year counts as rich. Well, what about someone earning a mere cent less than that? And so on forever. Now, in the case of moral value, we say it's clear that humans possess it, clear that inanimate objects do not, but unclear at precisely what point one attains the status of the other. Accordingly, there would be all sorts of borderline cases in between. And from here, one might well try to construct some hierarchy from humans to inanimate things, which puts less than fully functional humans on the end deserving moral status, and animals just past that threshold. But we would of course want some justification for this demarcation other than, well, I don't like the taste of human meat. Now, if we think of moral value along these lines, another interesting feature of namethetrait comes to light, and that is its resemblance to Sordy's paradoxes. We're told we have this heap of moral worth, the human. Now surely this heap gets its moral value from somewhere, yet whenever we subtract any potential property we are left with a moral heap. So taking any single property from a human never seems to remove the moral value, whereas removing large swathes surely does at some perhaps indeterminate point. So much like taking a single grain from a heap will never unmake a heap, but taking larger quantities very much will. If this analogy is compelling, I suggest it motivates the cluster approach I discussed earlier and in part 1 when speaking of moral properties. Because removing clusters of properties certainly would have the desired effect at some point. Imagine I remove your upper torso. It seems quite undeniable that your remaining portion does not deserve moral consideration at this point. So what about the vegan and all this? What's their upshot? Well, they could argue their position will be simpler than the meat eaters for not having to erect a distinction between animals and humans. Perhaps they can even offer a plausible single property account of moral status in terms of, say, sentience or capacity to suffer or feel pain. Of course, we can run the trait argument here too. It can often be indeterminate whether or not a coma patient will regain sentience, but many wouldn't think their moral status similarly indeterminate. For pain, we can think of congenital analgesics, but suffering is a little more tricky. Maybe some thought involved with ecstasy experimentation. In any case, the hope is that the vegan can explain away these cases and offer a simpler position. But even if this can be done, I prefer the multi-property approach for its flexibility and ability to capture actual ethical practice. So I'm not convinced there is much gained in simplicity, but I am worried some nuance could be lost. The additional contention made by meat eaters is that there is some cluster which justifies all or most of their current behaviour. No easy feat to be sure, but neither is a proven contradictory by the vegan argument.